can now bring in France 24's International Affairs editor, Angela Diffley. Angela, great to see you as always. Talk us through the context of today's commemorations.
Yeah. About 100 days ago, Emmanuel Macron said, we will now embark on 100 days of calm and I will review things on the 14th of July. That was after a particularly violent episode around the pension reform, yes. Which mostly on the far left, but you know, a lot of protests became violent on the margins, and some quite strong violence around that pension reform. He felt, we should now embark in France on a period of calm. The reform was enacted. That was over, in his point of view, and calm was to ensue, and he would take stock on the 14th of July. Well, 2 weeks ago, huge riots around the country on the outskirts of many French towns and villages, often low-income populations, sometimes descended from immigrants or newly arrived immigrants in those areas. And we all saw the very significant rioting. That has really tarnished France's image abroad, and it is not the sort of image France wants to project. King Charles's visit was cancelled because of the pension reforms. There was quite a lot of worry about how today's ceremony might go with Narendra Modi as a guest witnessing what might have been trouble. So there was very, very heavy security. That's for France's outside image. Within the country, the atmosphere is very difficult. Polls suggest that a lot of French people feel law and order is a huge issue in France, that Macron and his government do not have a handle on it, and it has shot up the priorities list. It was already quite high. They want law and order tackled, and there are questions around immigration and integration as well. And very many people feel that the 14th of July celebrations in lots of towns and cities around France were cancelled because there were fears of rioting, and also because some towns and cities said, we don't have any money to repair everything if it gets broken. And so a lot of people felt the country is being held hostage by a small number of violent people. And so the mood is one of anger, I would say, and annoyance. So short term, after these riots, I think we're likely to see perhaps better firearms training for the police, much tougher sentencing for young people who are caught in criminality or rioting. He is likely to get much tougher on this, Macron. On the long-term issue of these low-income, often heavily immigrant or descendants of immigrants, suburbs around French towns and cities, this is such a long-standing problem. They have thrown billions at it in programs, infrastructure, all sorts of programs. It's very difficult to know how to tackle this. Some people are suggesting that France should review its policy of not collecting statistics, because on the left, people say statistics would show that people are discriminated against. On the right, people are saying statistics would show that immigrants are responsible for a disproportionate amount of crime, or the descendants of immigrants. Both sides are starting to suggest that collecting statistics might be something to do.
Especially if you look at the UK and see how immigrants fare in that country versus in France. It's a big disparity.
I think you can't compare, because the two countries are very different, and also because there are no statistics in France. But there is an argument that it doesn't favour anybody not having any real knowledge. Of course, there are very many other countries that don't collect statistics. Germany doesn't, Japan doesn't. A lot of people after the Second World War made the decision that that was not something they wanted to do. But there are more calls now for it perhaps to change. We will see what happens. But this is a really long-standing problem, and it's difficult to get a handle on. By their very nature, these areas have a concentration of families with difficult social problems, because those who succeed tend to move up and out and are replaced by more families with a collection of problems. So by their very nature, they're difficult to deal with.
True. Let's talk about today's events. We also had India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was a guest of honor at these Bastille Day commemorations. He was also given France's highest honor, the Legion of Honor, by French President Emmanuel Macron. Why all the fuss?
Look, India is the biggest country in the world, 1.4 billion people, and everybody, every country is courting India, particularly as a counterweight to China increasingly. And a lot of people have been saying Macron should talk about human rights issues. He might do in private. There certainly won't be any public lectures, not least because France has its own problems to deal with. This relationship is very much based on the fact that they want to deepen their trade and defence ties. France is the second biggest supplier of arms to India after Russia, and they have a lot of cooperation in that field. Civil aviation, nuclear, and also defence areas are areas where there's a lot of cooperation. We've already seen that India is to buy 26 Rafale jets. So this is very much about that. There isn't a significant population of Indians in mainland France. This isn't about courting votes as it might be in the US or in Britain, where there are big hitting Indian minorities. That said, France has interests not very far away from India. Mayotte and Réunion are two overseas French departments in the Indian Ocean, and it has soldiers in Djibouti as well. So there are interests, and France and India do joint patrols very often. So there are a lot of shared interests. Also Ukraine. India is sitting on the fence, buying oil from Russia and not taking side. And India, like very many countries outside Europe and the US, say, look, there are lots of territorial incursions, invasions around the world. There's only a huge fuss when it involves either Europe or the US. And for the moment, they're likely to stay on the fence. You might try to encourage them to impose sanctions, which they haven't done so far, but it's not likely to
It's not likely
yield.
to happen, despite what Paris may want. Thank you very much for that, Angela Diffley.